Hey CDA, and welcome back to this Dyson Sphere Masterclass. As you can see, we're nearing the end because we are going to be producing all this juicy white science. But in order to get to this point, we're going to need a couple more builds. I would also like to thank Brian Herschel and Petros Dragoa for becoming members of the channel. You guys are awesome and your support is very much appreciated. Now, if we're looking at our pretty awesome starting planet, as you can see, we're making a lot of use out of the room we have on this planet, although we still have quite a bit of room left, honestly, so you can expand this further if you want, and we actually are going to need to add a couple of things to our mall. First and foremost, we're going to need the launching silos as well as these array receivers, because this will allow us to actually start building our Dyson Sphere, and this will allow us to collect any power or start making antimatter from the sphere itself. Now, in order to make those things, you're actually going to need a couple of things like lenses and nanotubes, and it's actually easier to just bring those in. And remember, we are actually producing lenses and nanotubes as well as graphene. In our builds, we're supplying that to anywhere we need it in the universe, so you might as well just request it in. Just make sure you don't request too much. You don't want to have 10,000 lenses stuck in here or anything like that. And again, make sure that if you do it through a box like this, you only limit the inputs to about 1 or 2 squares. That's all you're going to need, because honestly, you don't need that many of them, you just need a little bit, so we're not going to dedicate an entire build just to make a little bit more lenses, because remember, we already have a build like that. Now, depending on how fast you're playing and what you're building in which order, you might feel like your mall is a little bit undertuned when it comes to certain materials or certain buildings. For example, I always notice that at this point in the game I need way more drones than I'm producing from that single build that we made a couple of episodes ago. Unless you're playing really slow, because then at this point you'll probably have produced thousands of them. But still, I would recommend just building that same little build a few more times, and also make sure that you check what inputs you're low on. And if you're low on anything, just duplicate the build you already have, or you can make an upgraded version of that, of course, and stick that in the empty spaces you have remaining on the planet. In my case, I just decided to take it easy and double up on the framework production a little bit, because you need those frameworks in order to make the silos. This was mostly to speed things up. You could just wait for a little longer. I actually built these a little bit too late. I should have planned ahead a little bit more, my bad. So this is why I'm trying to speed that up. But other than that, it's completely up to you. Just figure out what you need and supply your income accordingly. Another addition that you might want to consider adding to your mall at this point are the destroyers and corvettes. I especially like the destroyers. These are the spaceships that will actually help you defend your planets against waves. You can actually also try to take on hives with that, but taking on hives when they're still well defended is pretty much suicide. We don't really have the appropriate mechanisms yet in the game to really take them on efficiently while they're still well defended, but they are awesome when you're trying to conquer a planet, because you will get attacked while you're wiping out the planet from space as well, and a couple of destroyers will make short work of all those early waves that your enemy will be sending at you. One thing worth mentioning that apparently not a lot of people know is that when you go to a gas giant and you're building these rows of orbital collectors, you can just place them initially, and then once you have them built, you can just go to the map view and you scroll around the planet and build them very easily like that. So you don't need to fly around in circles around this planet. You can just easily build them like so. Now, before we transition to white science, you want to make sure you have all the non-white science stuff done. So especially anything that includes the colored stuff. The dark fog stuff you can do later. I actually recommend that you do that later. But you're going to need quite a bit of science in order to complete, for example, all the Dyson Sphere stress systems. And don't forget to also complete all your upgrades. Basically, you do everything that doesn't require white science. Now, in order to do that, we're also going to scale up our colored science production, although we don't want to overdo it, because as soon as we're done with all the colored science research, we are transitioning into white science, but the bottleneck will be the antimatter. And as you can see, we probably have quite a bit of science already in our inventory. Right now, green science is the bottleneck, because that's the stuff that we started making last. But still, we want to scale up this a little bit so we don't take forever to complete that last stuff in our technology tree. That said, I am going to show you very clean builds for every type of science, because why not? That means you just have a set of blueprints ready to go. and scale up whichever type of science you want. This, of course, being a very tiny setup, and that's all you need to start producing 3 blue science per second. Why 3? Well, honestly, it's not going to be your bottleneck. You don't need to produce huge amounts of blue science, and this is all you need. And if you need more blue science, you just copy paste this tiny little build and you're done. 3 smelters making copper, 5 of them making magnets, 3 of them making iron, and that's enough to fully supply 1 Mark III assembler making circuit boards and 1 of them making magnetic coils. Then you have those flipping back in here, and this is put in the actual ILS over here. And you actually only need 1 ILS, including the demand for the... Oh, I should actually set this to demand, including the demand for the warpers. And there you go, this is the blue science version. Well, if you thought the blue science build was easy, well, the red science build is actually even easier, because all you need is 12 smelters making graphite, and that is enough graphite to make you 3 red science per second. Now, I can hear you going, well, TDA, shouldn't you also make some hydrogen? The answer is yes, you do need hydrogen for red science as well, but I actually think you have so many different sources of hydrogen from your gas giants, from your oil production, from your nanotube production, stuff like that, that it's probably going to be sufficient to rely on that, because honestly, you don't need that much hydrogen to make red science. It's just 1 per cube. Now, you do need to keep an eye on that, because hydrogen is one of those sneaky little items in the game that you initially have way too much of, and then as you start scaling up, you will notice that you actually need quite a lot of hydrogen. For example, we're using a lot of that to make deuterium as well. So again, that's where your gas giants come in, because a lot of gas giants produce both deuterium as well as hydrogen. So long story short, keep an eye on that, but as long as you do that, then this build should be enough to scale up your red science. Remember how big of a pain it was initially to create that first yellow science? Well, at this point in the game, it's actually super easy to make a lot more. All you need is some smelters. In this case, I have a total of, how many is this? 18 smelters making titanium. And then we have a total of 8 assemblers, Mark III assemblers to be exact, making the titanium crystals. And the titanium crystals, of course, need the organic crystals, which was the painful part before, but now we can just mine that as a rare resource off different planets. So we just bring that in, bring in the titanium, and export the titanium crystals. Now, of course, again, you are also going to need diamonds in order to make yellow science, but you should be making your diamonds from kimberlite ore, which is plentiful across the entire universe, so there's no reason to make that manually. However, if you can't find it for whatever reason, then of course all you need to do is add in a couple of smelters that make graphite, I should say, and then transform that into the diamonds themselves. I just didn't add them in because most of the time they will just be sitting there doing exactly nothing. Things get a little bit more interesting once we hit purple science. However, we already made very clean builds for that, so all we need to do is upgrade them. Right here we have everything based on Mark II assemblers. We have Mark III ones now, so we just need to take out this last row and then reorganize this a little bit in order to make it more clean. And if you do that and you reorganize stuff a little bit so it looks more neat, then you end up with a build like this. Now you might be wondering what's going on with the belts over here. What I actually decided to do is, rather than using a straight line like this, I really don't like the way these things connect, so this is purely a visual thing, but what you can actually do is just press R twice when you're building the belts, and you can make diagonal belts, and this actually connects really cleanly. I have no idea why the other connection is still in the game, because it looks really ugly. But yeah, you do you. Just keep in mind that if you use diagonal belts like this can sometimes interfere with your blueprint working correctly, so keep an eye on that. But you do you. Next up is the redesign for the particle broadband build, and this is where the actual benefits of getting all those rare resources coming in is going to be super obvious. Because this is what you end up with if you take out everything that you no longer need because you have those rare resources. Actually, you could take out this part as well if you actually have access to the fractal silicon as well. As I pointed out before, it's not really a big deal. And as you can see, this is not much. You only need the assemblers. The nanotubes, we are making those in the rare resource build. The crystal silicon, I am still making those here because it's one of those resources that sometimes I find very early on and sometimes I don't. So I just don't want to bother about that. I don't want to conquer a planet specifically just for that purpose. And plastic, you do need to make yourself still, but that only requires some oil, which we're now mass producing, and a tiny little bit of graphite. So that's all there's to it. So now we get to clean this up. And this is all we end up with. As you can see, it's a tiny little build now rather than a pretty large one. This is also a good moment to mention that, as you can see, I have 4 colors of science here now being mass produced, and we are barely using any footprint at all. We don't need that much building space. So this is actually one of the reasons why I prefer just using the normal smelters rather than the planar ones, because you could actually start producing these already. You do need quite a bit of expensive resources, so that would mean dedicating more production to frameworks, but especially the plane filters are really annoying to make, so that's a lot of time and effort going into something that's only going to net you a slightly faster smelter. You're also going to need the unipolar magnet, so that's the last rare item that you can see in this list. You will find those usually around the neutron stars and black holes. Those tend to be on the outside of the galaxy, so it's a little bit annoying to get to initially. However, if you want to get those and upgrade all your smelters, basically you can halve all of the amounts that we have over here. If you upgrade them, that's completely fine. Keep in mind, though, that even though this smelter is twice as fast, it actually consumes about 4 times as much energy. So you're actually going down in terms of production efficiency, in terms of the power used. The same holds actually for the assemblers, but the assemblers you use in such large numbers that I think it's more worth it. But as you can see, all in all, the smelters don't take up that much space. So it's completely up to you, but I don't recommend necessarily transitioning to plain smelters at all. One more color of science to go, and that is green. And, well, we actually already made most of that because we already upgraded our content chips build, which is 1/2 of the part that we need in order to make green science. Now, again, here you can see we are using a ton of different assemblers. We're only using a fairly small amount of stuff for the actual smelter. So reducing this by half would cut in the size of the blueprint, but it's not going to be very significant if you compare that with using the lower tier of the assemblers. Then there is one more build that we need to upgrade, and that's the one for the graviton lens. So this is one that we made in the previous episode. We can cut out the entire bottom half now because this is all related to rare resources. We're making the diamonds elsewhere, we're making the graphene elsewhere, and we can also cut down a lot on the number of assemblers over here. And if you do that, you end up with a very clean, square looking build like this. And again, there's a huge amount of assemblers in here, and you could cut down half of the smelters over here if you want to, but I really like the looks of this build as it is. Now, that means we now have a nice set of different blueprints that will produce all the different colors that we need. It's interesting to see that the the right half over here actually produces 4 different types of colors of science, and the left half is completely dedicated to the green science. So there you can see the complexity of green science compared to everything else. But yeah, this is all you need to scale up the science as much as you can. Keep in mind that there is a limit to where that is pointful because, well, you're going to need quite a bit of science in order to unlock things like the Dyson Sphere stress system, and a couple of the upgrades later on in the tree over here are relatively expensive as well. But as soon as you complete all of that research, you're going to hit white science, and white science will require us to have a Dyson Sphere, which of course is what we're going to do next time. Now that is really fun, but as soon as you complete all the green science related stuff and you're onto white science, it will actually take quite a while for you to scale up your white science production. So don't overdo it in terms of scaling up your base production. Maybe just build every build once, maybe twice, but I would stop there and then focus on getting your Dyson Sphere up and running. With all of those nice clean builds done, we might as well fit a couple of them on our starting planet because, well, honestly, most of them don't take that much space. I'm actually going to limit the purple and green science production to the secondary planet because, well, that's where the rest of that production is as well, just to keep myself sane. Depends a little bit though where you have most of your power, because if you do have surplus power on one of your planets, you might as well put that to use. And by doing so, we're going to scale up all this science production and make sure we have plenty of science waiting for as soon as we unlock that antimatter. And you know, don't underestimate how much power all of this is going to cost you. As you can see, I'm sitting at almost 2 gigawatts of power production on our starting planet at this point, but we're also consuming almost at the same amount. So between all the production that you're doing, this planetary shield and stuff like that, you want to make sure you have enough power, because again, if you're going to scale up your production but you don't have enough power, you're not scaling up anything, you're just building buildings that are not going to add anything. You're going to need quite a bit of resources in order to actually build all of the stuff that we're going to be building in this episode, so don't forget to expand your production as you go. Now, these offensive hubs that we built in the last episode are going to be super useful, because as soon as you power them on, you should be starting to destroy the relays. Make sure you have a couple of these missile turrets set to attack upper air as well. You could actually have a couple of them, I don't recommend doing this with all of them, but a couple of them set to prioritize this and actually set everything else at balanced, which makes sure that you also always have a couple of these firing at any relays that are in range. And as soon as you take down the relays, this stuff will start powering down, and it makes it so much easier to conquer your planets. However, as you can see, you will get attacked from space, so this is why there is the planetary shields included in here. If you haven't done so yet, at this point you really should start finding yourself a planet that has a grading crystal deposit on it, so you can start mining that, so you can start mass producing those awesome advanced mining machines. They just make spreading out across the galaxy so much easier than doing it with all these manual miners setting up belts and stuff like that, so make sure you take advantage of those. However, don't worry too much about actually gathering a huge amount of resources, because, well, you actually need the builds to consume those as well. And actually building a Dyson Sphere takes forever, so we are going to get started with that. And we're going to do that on the third planet in our system. So this is the one closest to the sun, mostly because that has an easier time to actually build the Dyson Sphere, because A, it's closer, and B, it has a higher uptime because it has an easier time getting the sphere in range. But there's also a very practical reason. There's nothing on this planet yet other than some mines at this point, so we have plenty of room to build over here. Now, in order to build a Dyson Sphere, we're going to need a lot of solar cells, which are pretty straightforward to make, and we're also going to need rockets. And especially rockets are, unsurprisingly, the most complicated item in the entire game. However, we already have a couple of building blocks in order to build this, because we are already producing quantum chips and we're already producing deuterium fuel rods. So all we need to do now is start producing Dyson Sphere components. That means that this is actually going to be a bit of a modular build in order to make sure that we make full use of all the designing work that we already did. Step 1, we are going to make a lot of solar cells. Specifically, we're going to make a build that produces 12 solar cells per second. If that sounds like a lot, well, yes it is, but you're actually going to need quite a lot of those, and half of that is actually going to go into our rocket production. In order to get that going, we have a total of 18 glass smelters over here. We're going to add in 3 smelters making iron and 2 smelters making copper. Then we're going to add in a single Mark III assembler making circuit boards, and then 3 more making prisms, and we're almost done already. Because all we need to add in are 6 assemblers making photon combiners, making use of those circuit boards and prisms, and then 8 more assemblers making the actual solar cells. Now, if you've done your math, you'll notice like, hey, TDA, these are not actually producing 12 per second, this is only 6 per second. Also, I want to point out that you're going to need to bring in that graphene, because, you know, these things actually need photocombiners and graphene. Now, you will be right, but all we need to do is basically copy this, flip it around. You can actually do it very easily like this, so just copy paste this, flip it around, place it down here somewhere, try to align it a little bit so that every set of buildings is actually aligned, and then place an ILS in the middle. And there you go, now we have our entire build done, and this is going to fill up really fast with all these solar cells we're ever going to need. Now, the second thing we're going to need in order to make our rockets are the deuterium fuel rods, and of course we made a build for that in the previous episode already. All you need to do is copy that in twice, and of course make sure you have enough materials in order to supply that. Similarly, you need the upgraded quantum chips built in order to make enough quantum chips for the rockets themselves as well. And again, you're going to need that build twice. This is the exact same build that we made in the previous episode, so just copy it in twice. And if you look at it, look at how nicely that actually aligns with the other builds that we have. So we have the solar cells over here, the fuel rods over here, and the quantum chips over here, and it looks really nice and tidy. Now, we're going to need to make the actual Dyson Sphere components, and for those of you that like using the planar smelters, this will be the moment to get them out, although I'm still going to use the Mark Is. As you will see in a moment, we're going to need a lot of smelting. We're trying to make 1 rocket per second, and in order to do that, we're actually going to need 60 smelters making silicon, as you can see here. So I have 4 rows of 15 smelters. Next up on the list are 30 smelters for the iron, and I'm actually going to leave a little bit of a line in between because we are going to need to bring in some other resources as well. For example, we are going to need some copper production, and these are 18 smelters making copper ingots. The reason I didn't put them in a line with this is because these are rows of 15 and these are rows of 18, and we're going to need some more of those. Specifically, we are going to need 18 smelters making steel, and you guessed it, we're also going to need 18 smelters making titanium alloy. Now, of course, we also are going to need to produce the titanium itself. I'm assuming we're going to build that over here. And this just shows you how many smelters we're actually going to need. Keep in mind, though, that if you replace these with planar smelters, you're actually going to use twice as much energy than just using the Mark 1 version. So if you're short on energy, make sure you're careful about that. We're not entirely done yet with the smelters yet, though, because we still need 12 smelters making titanium. And if you're wondering why I'm leaving empty spaces over here, I'm actually going to add in a lot more belts down here in order to funnel in the end product. But before we can get to that, let's continue up here because we are going to need to make some other basic stuff. This part of the build might seem really familiar to you because we're going to add in 4 of these assemblers making circuit boards. And then we're going to add in 16 assemblers making crystalline components. And as you can see, it all aligns quite nicely with those rows of 18 of these smelters. It's not exact, but it's close enough because these buildings are just a little bit more wide than the smelters are, because we're not actually leaving room in between. You can just build them as a row. It's close enough in order to keep this thing as square as we can. Of course, where crystalline components are, the processors are not far behind, so that's the next thing we're actually going to be building. You're going to need a total of 12, and that makes sure we have a nice little square here producing the processors. Now, did I start this build very close to a volt line? Yes, I did, and I think we're going to add in some more assemblers over here. So whenever you get into a situation like this, you have no choice but to just save the build, make a blueprint out of it, then delete the build and then place it wherever you need to move it to, because, well, you don't want to build your blueprints across volt lines. If the sheer size of this build it wasn't clear to you just yet, well, wait until we start adding in 24 Mark III assemblers making framework. Well, that's a lot of resources that you're going to need to produce all of that, hence all the smelters. So don't underestimate how much this is actually going to soak up in terms of raw ore. However, with all of that framework in production, we can bring down the processors and framework down here to the place where we're going to be building the Dyson Sphere components. Now, as you can see, I added in a total of 11 of these down here, and we're also going to be bringing in the solar cells from the other build. Now, I've already built a belt here, but there's no ILS yet to bring them in. That will come in a second. Because first things first, we're actually also going to be producing the actual rockets in here. We're going to need 4 assemblers making the rockets, and as you can see, everything nicely aligns with each other. So this looks like a pretty decently organized build. Now, in order to actually build the rockets, we're going to have to bring in not only the solar cells, but also the fuel rods and the quantum chips. So now we're going to add in some ILSs. And when I say ILS, I just mean for the raw resources, because you only need a PLS, so a planetary logistics station, in order to bring in those 3 materials that we're making elsewhere in this build. Because remember, this is a modular build, so what you want to do is actually set the receiving ILSs over here and set them to remote storage. So not to remote demand or remote supply, just set them to remote storage. So this will ensure that this will actually not export off this planet. You can still set this to local supply because, well, we actually want this to be locally supplied specifically to this PLS over here in the rocket build, but you don't want this to be starting to flying all over the planets that you have elsewhere. Now, this will not really happen with the solar cells to begin with, but for example, with the, with the quantum chips, those will actually get exported because they're also part of your science production. But if you set it to remote storage, it will produce a little bit and then just stop producing until you actually need it. So if you want this to also be used towards your science production early on, that's fine. But as soon as this build is done, I recommend that you set it to remote storage just to make sure that your supply system is actually delivering them where they need to go. Now, once you get your rocket production going, you're going to need a launching facility in order to make sure you can actually use all those solar cells and all those rockets. And it should look something like this. I really like building them at the poles because that makes just a very convenient location to make a build like this. And let me walk you through what I have over here. So first of all, we have the rail guns that are set to launch our solar cells up into the sky. As you can see, it's only a couple of them actually working right now. Apparently there's some very weird angle towards where we actually need to go. But ideally they should all be firing at the same time. Then second of all, there is the array receivers that we have over here. You can see that there is lenses on this belt over here. So putting a lens into a array receiver makes it super more efficient, and one lens will last you for a very, very long time. So even though lenses themselves are pretty expensive to make, it's definitely worth getting them into your array receivers just for the additional efficiency. Then on the outer ring over here, we have the missile silos, of course. These are launching all the nicer rockets that we are now producing up onto the Dyson Sphere. And this is before the time where you could run belts through your building. So even though it looks like you should be able to do this, and hopefully that is something that will change in the future, for now we still have to manually get them in with a sorter. Then I also added some planetary defenses to this, just to make sure that this doesn't get blown up by the enemy. And last but not least, in the middle over here, we have this facility with all these particle colliders. Now, this ILS in the middle is going to request the critical photons. So all of these array receivers are not set to power production, because honestly, that's kind of a waste. You can make power in tons of different ways, but you can only make critical photons in one way. And all the critical photons from the array receivers are going to go into the ILS over here. Now the ILS is going to transport that into a circular belt over here. Then the particle colliders are going to transform that into antimatter and hydrogen. So remember, you also need somewhere for the hydrogen to go. And just to make sure this doesn't actually get backlogged anytime soon, I just put in some additional belts just in case the hydrogen is not actually being exported. It should be exported. If it's not, you're not making enough deuterium and you're not making enough deuterium fuel rods, which you should be making anyway to power all your planets. I'm just saying that make sure you have a backup system just in case. Now, that's pretty much all there is to it. You could honestly remove probably like 3 out of every 4 of these particle colliders over here, because as you can see, they're not really busy, and it's a pretty fast recipe. So you can see the antimatter going in here, or sorry, the critical photons getting in here, and they're not even reaching like the 3rd or 4th particle collider. So of course you are going to scale up your production in the end game if you're continuing to play. So this is mostly meant for that, but you're only going to need like a handful of these particle colliders if you're once you're starting out in the beginning. One trick that might not be obvious to everyone initially is that you can actually proliferate your rockets, and if you do, that will actually allow them to be launched a lot faster. That's the only thing it's going to do, just launch them faster. But honestly, launching rockets can be really slow, especially if you already have a pretty solid rocket production and you're starting a new sphere, for example. So just a little trick to be aware of that might be very useful if you're trying to scale up your production even further. Speaking of starting out small and scaling up, I would really recommend that you start out with a small sphere. Now, the reason for this is twofold. First of all, it's going to be a lot more satisfying to actually see your build coming together. And if you make a large, complicated build, it's going to take hours upon hours for that to be completed, especially considering we don't have a massive amount of rocket production yet. I mean, 1 rocket per second is actually pretty good, don't get me wrong, but still it's going to take you quite a while to complete even a small sphere like this. The second reason is that if you look at a lot of guides and other content creators, they point out that if you make a large sphere and you make it large enough so you can have a planet within the sphere, which our closest planet actually is, you could make a sphere that actually envelops the planet that we're currently on. Sure, that's a benefit, but you can achieve the same result by just making a large swarm. So as you can see, I have a swarm at the max distance, just to make sure that I can easily get solar cells into the swarm. And then the actual sphere itself is just tiny. And remember, you can add more and more layers to the swarm. You can edit the layers that you already have. You can do whatever you want with this and expand on that. Just start out small and scale it up later as you go. Also, TDA from the future here, I initially forgot to actually proliferate the antimatter, so make sure you don't forget to do that yourself. Then back at our Science Hub, we're actually going to transition this Science Hub from normal science production, or I should say research, to white science production itself. And this is the beauty, I think, of this design, because we have had this secondary or tertiary belt, I should say, on the outside from the get-go, and we also have this empty belt sitting here on the inside that we haven't actually been using. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to add in and request the antimatter from here. That is going to come from the other planet, and we're also going to set white science to be supplied here. Then on the outer belt, we can have the antimatter go in here, and as you can see, there's already sorters in place, so this will get picked up by the actual matrices lab. Now what we can do is we can switch this to the production of white science. As you can see, it will vacuum up all of that stuff, and we have the antimatter coming in as well, so this will allow us to start producing white science. And of course, we are going to do that all the way around, collect the cubes if you want, or just delete them and put them back in the actual inventory. That might be a bit of an issue, that, by the way, because as you can see, I have a lot of science production waiting for me already. Now, make sure that before you do that, you actually completed the entire technology tree, because you can always shift it back, of course, but that's just tedious. So I would recommend that you make sure you complete anything that you want that actually requires the colored types of science. Then, next step, we are going to transition the build over here on the side. This is going to start actually collecting the science, and that means that all we need to do is put the white science here, let's say over here, and we are going to be requesting that, so either locally or remotely, doesn't really matter, and then put the outgoing stuff on a belt like this. Again, make sure you proliferate that, because if you don't, that's just going to waste you a lot of science. And this facility over here should be able to take care of all your technology research for a very, very long time. And there you have it. Look at all that white science now in production. As you can see, after the initial burst of collecting all the antimatter that I had stored up, and you can see it's slowing down slightly now. And that means that we are now pretty much into the end game, late game, whatever you want to call it. All we need to do now is scale up the Dyson Sphere even further, scale up our rocket production even further, potentially find a nice high luminosity sun somewhere and actually build another Dyson Sphere across that one. Basically, you just keep repeating what you have already been doing and just scale things up even further. Now, I have to admit that is not my favorite part of the game, because it's basically just repeating what you've already done. But if you like seeing your factory grow, then you can make completely planet-wide blueprints with rocket production, for example, or even more science production, and take it from there. All you need to do is make sure that you supply it with enough resources. Now, let me know in the comments, is there anything else you would like to see in this masterclass? I mean, we can continue on if you guys want, but this will allow you to pretty much complete the game, get the you win the game pop-up. Something fun that I recommend that you do at this point is making sure you unlock all the upgrades to your ground fleet and your space fleet, because it basically will turn yourself into a one-man army. So that is something we could explore in one of the next episodes, or anyway, let me know in the comments what you would like to see. If you're still here, you're awesome, and hopefully by now you have also completed the game. So that is very awesome, and I also want to highlight all the people that have been joining me as a member over the last few times. This is not even all of you. I am running out of stars to name you. I haven't actually visited enough stars yet to have everyone's names showing up on the screen. I really appreciate it, guys, and it's amazing how many people have been joining up. So thank you guys for that as well, and I do hope to catch all of you in the next one.